Hey guys, Ramsey here. Welcome to another video. Today we have a review, and it's actually a niche fragrance review. If you've been following the channel, you know I try and mix things up a little bit. I try and keep things fresh and go in a lot of different directions, which has been kind of the calling card of my channel. I go everywhere. And I've been trying to do a review of a vintage fragrance, a niche fragrance, a designer, you know, a cheapy, expensive fragrance. I try and mix everything in, and I try and mix in the list, so we're not just doing lists or just doing reviews, right? And so I recently did a top 40 most powerful vintage feminine fragrances. You should check that out for sure, especially if you're a guy and you're not familiar with some of those. Those are some of the most amazing fragrances I've come across in my entire journey. So today we're going to talk about a niche fragrance from the brand DS Durga, and it's called Bowmakers. It came out in the year 2012, so it's been around for a little while, and this is a pretty unique artistic, it's come to symbolize the brand for me, the brand of DS Durga. I've been pleasantly surprised with. I've got a DS Durga live stream on the channel if you would like to check it out. So you can go watch some of my early impressions on some DS Durga samples that were sent my way. And I've got some individual reviews. I recently, well, I say recently, within the last 6 or 8 months, I reviewed Amber Kiso by the House. And I really, really enjoyed Amber Kiso. That's one that I would totally add to the collection if it wasn't for the fact that I can't buy anything right now. And so this is one such fragrance that really sits in this kind of image in my head of how I perceive the brand and how the brand presents itself. I only own one from the House, actually. It's called Spirit of the Glen. It's discontinued and very hard to find, but it's probably one of my favorite boozy fragrances I've ever come across. I have a discontinued gem fragrance review of this on the channel, but they have the ability to absolutely knock it out of the park. And Bowmakers is maybe one such example of a very unique and artistic fragrance that they created. So here's the blurb. There's actually a longer blurb, but it goes into, Thoreau and Emerson and kind of goes off track. I'm going to read the short blurb to you guys, but if you want, there's an entire story on the DS Durga website. So it says, amid the transcendental woods of the 1800s, craftsmen from the Massachusetts Bay Colony built violins and bows, old-growth mahogany, burled maple shavings, amber pine rosin, aged walnut, and unique secret varnishes. That's all it says in the short blurb. 50 mils is $210, 100 mils is $300. So average pricing, somewhat expensive, but average nowadays. Sad to say that that is average, but it is what it is. So here's the note listing according to Parfumo. Violin, varnish, mahogany, air accord, which is the least of all the notes listed. The air accord, do not think there's anything fresh or outdoorsy about this fragrance at all. Colophony, which is a specific type of pine rosin, cypress, maple wood, tree resin, cedar, and moss in the base. Oak moss or moss. The perfumer is David Seth Moltz, who was the brand owner, I think, and perfumer for most of these. And there is some news, though. David did sell the brand within the last 7 to 9 months, I believe, within the last year at least. And it's unfortunate they were purchased by the House of Manzanita Capital, who owns Diptyque, which you'll be hearing some more about Diptyque on the channel. They're one of the niche brands that I've been kind of sidelined for whatever reason, but I do have Tam Dao. They've got an oud, which I can't remember everything, but there is I'm probably looking at it, I just can't see the name. There's an oud, Laotian, God, now I gotta look it up. It's driving me crazy. What is Diptyque oud? Oud Palau, excuse me, Oud Palau. It has Laotian oud in it, but Oud Palau is Diptyque's oud. I've got Oud Palau, I've got Eau Duel, I've got a bunch of different diptyques that are on the radar to be discussed very soon on the channel. So something to keep in mind. But Manzanita Capital owns Diptyque. And some folks think that that could potentially spell trouble for DS Durga, that anytime these big conglomerate houses buy a house, they're always focused on profits, which means potential price increases, maybe less artistic quality down the road, that kind of thing, right? So something to keep an eye on and at least discuss. But for now, what ended up happening is David, who, not the David brand owner and perfumer, but David, if you go watch my old unboxings and you follow the channel, he sent me a bunch of cigars and a bunch of these beautiful little samples. And this is one that's kind of caught my attention. He sent me a very generous 5 ml decant, and then another perfume god person sent me this, Bowmakers. And it's an officially branded sample. And you notice that I took it all apart because the damn thing wouldn't spray. I detest these little atomizer things. So I got the pliers and ripped the damn thing apart, and I've just been pouring it on my skin today. And the reason is I wanted to make sure what I was testing matched up with the official branded sample, and it did. Perfect match. Can tell almost no differences between the two. So this is described as like a woody, resinous, spicy, smoky, green type scent, okay? And so here's the thing. This fragrance to me starts off very similar to something like a Comme des Garçons. In fact, if you blindfolded me and said, what brand made this? I would say Comme des Garçons. I've got about a 5-hour dry down here and about a 1-hour dry down here. It is my scent of the day today. And I think I've reviewed some Comme des Garçons on the channel. Like, for example, I reviewed Comme des Garçons Black. You can go watch my review of that. I also plan on reviewing Two Man by Comme des Garçons, which is my favorite from the house so far that I've come across. But I haven't smelled a lot. Comme des Garçons is one of those houses I would really love to do a deep dive into. But it shares this strange old garage feeling with what you might expect from a fragrance like Black, with this kind of weird dusty attic, like you're at your grandma's house where the wood was in the house is over 100 years old, and there's this kind of old ancient feel. And inside of the attic in your grandma's box, in her crate, you find this old sort of Messiah Stradivarius, but she has no clue what she owns. She has no clue it's worth millions of dollars. It's just been sitting in this dusty attic. And the garage gives you this implication of where the varnish is kind of stored, right? Because varnish and the violin are going to go hand in hand with this review. More on that to come. And of course the attic, because the violin is stored up there in this dusty, out of the way, kind of, woody, cobwebs and spider webs everywhere because it's kind of neglected up there. That's the setting for me when I smell this. And so if you can imagine in your head this texture of mahogany wood, and with all of its kind of flammy, irregular twists here and there, and just where the hardwood seems to veer off in one texture or another, and then just imagine all the different commonly used woods that are used in making a violin. So think of things like spruce and willow and maple, especially maple, ebony, especially ebony, because the maple, we'll talk a little bit about why the maple is important later on, but the ebony specifically, because I want you to imagine a very dark wood, almost veering on black. If you can imagine those colors, like the darker browns and the reddish tones, and almost veering to black, dark wood. Think about the wood being that dark. That's the way that the wood smells in this. It has this darkness, this richness, this thick texture to it. And of course, rosewood. Rosewood can sometimes give off this little bit of a lavender-like feel, but rosewood's one of my favorite woods. I absolutely love it. So just imagine all these different woods that violins use are used to make violins. So the thing that my nose picks up on in the first 20 minutes or so, let's say, is a pretty good hit of spice. All right. So you're not going to get a spice listing actually in the note listing. Whenever I read the note listing, there's no spice. But if you pay close attention, especially in the first 20 minutes, you're going to pick up a couple spices that are pretty prominent to my nose. One is cardamom. The other is sort of this black pepper, okay? And it gives the fragrance a woody, peppery profile because of the woods mixed with this peppery, spicy bit in the opening. And the spice actually grows in strength within the first 20 minutes or so. At first, you don't get it as much, and it begins to grow in strength gradually, like a violin player gradually building up to this sort of crescendo, right? And you can hear the music in your head even though no one's playing this violin, but you can almost hear it in your head, like Mozart. So the way that the spices are handled in the opening, I think it's a brilliant opening to me, because you get the depth, you get the darkness of the woods, and you get these spices that I think they just kind of like naturally and effortlessly allow your nose to almost sense this feeling of a journey, like uncovering and holding this rare violin that you found in your grandma's attic in your hands. The spice blend is almost like this intro. It's like a discovery moment, if you will. Have you ever seen the cover of ELO's album Discovery, where the guy is like looking down at what he's discovered with this intense awe? So there's this discovery moment. So metaphorically, it could be the dust and the cobwebs that you have to kind of move aside before your brain starts to unpack this amazing gem of a violin, right? So now, most folks, unless they, I would say, either play the violin or used to play the violin, or they have like a family member who owns a violin that plays where they can go in there and sneak it and hold it kind of thing, have never held a violin. So for me, I fall into that category of never actually holding a violin in my hands, okay? I don't know exactly what it feels like to hold it and touch it and play the strings and all that stuff, but this fragrance does an amazing job of kind of storytelling in a way that allows your imagination to just think about what it would be like if you were holding a violin in your hands, okay? It transports you. This is a very transportative scent for me, allowing me to imagine something that I've never done. That's one of the beauties of fragrances. And so for me, this imagination of this violin being held in your hands is so realistic. You don't have to own one, you know, to in real life to imagine it in your mind's eye. And so Bowmakers checks the box perfectly. It's a great example of a well-made niche fragrance that does interesting things and gives you a beautiful plot line, and it really takes you on a journey, okay? And so in my mind, the spice is almost like the anticipation in the opening, because you get these little hints of green cooling cardamom. The cooling cardamom aspect, by the way, is maybe the only element of this fragrance that I can even somewhat think about like a outdoors air accord. I don't get that at all. Of all of the notes I talked about, that is the one that's totally out of left field for me. Everything in this fragrance is pretty deep and dark and heavy feeling, okay? So in my mind, the spice, which does come across pretty heavy because of that black pepper, it's different from pink pepper. You know, pink pepper is much more in the designer realm. It's much more likable in the opening. It has that rosy feeling to it. But black pepper almost like cuts through. It's something like a sharp edge, right? It just cuts through what you're smelling. And so when you smell this spice combination, in my mind, it's like the anticipation of discovering this amazing violin. And you're assuming to find some old, ancient violin in grandma's attic. But when you open the case, instead of this 50-year-old violin that hasn't been touched, imagine, stay with me. This is supposed to be a fun review because it's kind of a fun fragrance in an interesting kind of way. But when you open it up, it's not 50-year-old violin that hasn't been touched. It's actually just freshly been coated in varnish, okay? That is the journey in my mind's eye, as if someone just tried to restain the wood. So put all the dust and cobwebs back just as they found it after they restained it and allowed you to come and discover this amazing violin. So if you click on the note of violin varnish in Parfumo, just out of curiosity, you'll see that this is actually the only fragrance with that specific note listed. So hats off to DS Durga, I would say, for doing something unique. This fragrance was created in 2012. So again, who knows what the future of the brand is going to be now that they're purchased from one of the big boys. But needless to say, this is kind of, to me, what niche should be all about. Doing things different, trying things that are off the beaten path, which they were obviously doing back then. Now, however, as I have said, one thing I will say is that there are some niche and designer scents in an effect where there are some fragrances that kind of remind me of this just a little bit. So if you go back to something like Comme des Garçons 2-Man, that came out all the way back in 2004, all right? And that has this mahogany wood feeling that definitely shares some similarities with this. If I could maybe draw one line from one fragrance, or one or two fragrances from this, if you could take Comme des Garçons Black and Comme des Garçons 2-Man and kind of blend them together with this interesting varnish note, you're in the ballpark, okay? Also, the cedar note, which ends up coming through in Bowmakers, really gives homage to Gucci Pour Homme from 2003, the one by Michel Almerac that is now discontinued. There is a review of Gucci Pour Homme from 2003 on the channel, one of the best designers in the 2000s, in my opinion. I really enjoyed that scent. And so the way that the wood note is executed in Bowmakers anyways pays homage to Gucci Pour Homme 3. If you watched my review of Gucci Pour Homme 3, there were some folks that said Gucci Pour Homme 3, or sorry, Gucci Pour Homme from 2003 had this sort of log cabin-like feel. Like the cedar gives this actual wood feel, very realistic. And maybe that's why instantly my brain puts Bowmakers in some place like an attic where you would expect old wood smells to kind of permeate your brain. The wood just feels like it kind of festers in there. It's not necessarily rotten or moldy like oud would smell, but there is this kind of festering, enclosed feeling to the scent. Also, there is a note of maple wood that's used, okay? And maple wood is one of the toughest and most durable woods. It gives off kind of a slightly sweet note about the wood, but not as sweet as like maple syrup. I don't want you to think you're literally pouring maple syrup on here because you're not. But the sweet feeling in my mind adds to this image of creating this varnish like not just texture, but if you can imagine actually putting a paintbrush in varnish and pulling it out and putting it on the wood, and you have that coat that goes on top of the wood, right? But it could also drip. You know, the varnish can drip. It can gloop. It can all these different words to just imagine the varnish not being properly put on. And so I think the sweetness of the maple wood, the little bit of sweetness that you get, really gives you hints in your mind's eye. In my mind, the word that came to mind was glaze. And so if you can just imagine, instead of it being maple syrup, just like a glaze. And that glaze feeling works perfectly with the varnish that I think David was trying to build. So the glaze, or as I have said millions of times, when it comes to something like oud, this lacquered wood-like feeling, which is exactly almost what this smells like. It smells like a lacquered wood or a varnish or a wood stain, if you will, but it smells totally different from how you would expect a lacquered note in an oud fragrance to make sense. If that makes sense. They both go kind of in the same direction, but they go about it smelling totally different, if that makes sense. So if you can just imagine kind of still having this fresh lacquered turpentine-like coat of paint feeling over this beautiful old violin. So my guess is that wood sealant, I think about brands like Rust-Oleum, wood finish, wood polish, wood, what would you call it? I guess like wood paint, not paint thinner, but like almost like a wood stain. Is exactly what this is doing, but in a totally different direction to something like oud, okay? So if you can just imagine this Rust-Oleum like finish accord on the violin, it's probably achieved through a combination of a bunch of different notes that you wouldn't expect. So the one that occasionally plays peekaboo that I really enjoy is frankincense. And frankincense, now the brand doesn't admit that there's any frankincense in this creation, but they do admit that there's a note called colophony. And when I read that in the note listing, most people probably just glossed over it because that's exactly what I did. But apparently it's a very specific type of pine rosin, they call it. And it's obtained from the pine tree and used in things like surface coatings, lubricants, adhesives, sealants, and as well as the rosin for string instruments. So if you've ever seen like somebody with a string instrument running something over the strings, a lot of times that is this particular rosin from my understanding. There's an entire instruction manual on how to apply rosin to your string instruments. Again, I've never even held a string instrument in my hand, so you know, this is like I don't know, maybe a 5-year-old putting ketchup on a filet mignon or something, but it definitely, to me, gives off this frankincense-like accord. And that may be because pine, it has these pine-like aspects, which many times frankincense can give off this smoky pine-like smell. So it almost feels like this violin legend just like appears in the attic with you, snatches the instrument out of your hand, backhands you because he doesn't think you're worthy of holding such a beautiful instrument, plays the violin with such passion and enthusiasm that smoke starts to literally come out of the strings of the violin. And now you're smelling wood and varnish and a bit of smoke. Okay, that's how the fragrance smells. It smells like you're getting this, you know, friction, creating this amazing amount of smoke coming from the violin. And for those of you that don't know, the bows from the name Bowmakers have been made out of all sorts of materials in the past. Especially there's a word called catgut, which basically, I don't think they make it actually out of cats, but catgut strings are made out of things like sheep, cattle, kangaroo, and water buffalo. the outer intestine, apparently. So most gut strings are constructed out of what they call serosa, which is the outermost intestine of cattle. Okay, so they all kind of, that's a natural string material that they used to use back in the day. Now I think they're mostly made out of things like nylon or steel or, I don't know, some synthetic type string. It's funny because there are some old timers apparently who really prefer the natural string sound of catgut to this quote unquote synthetic string. It reminds me a little bit of the fragrance community actually, but if you can just take like a snapshot of that image I'm trying to paint. I know this is kind of a little bit of a a review that's a little fun and a little out there, okay? Stay with me on the story though. If you can just imagine this sort of trying to paint this picture of a dusty attic, violin worth millions, grandma knew nothing about, the spices kind of building up the anticipation, and the varnish dripping wet on a violin that hasn't been touched in 50 years. The professional appears, gives you a dressing down for having no business holding such a priceless relic in your hand, proceeds to play it with such ferocity that the strings start to smoke, and that is the meat and potatoes of this scent. To me, that is the heart and soul of Bowmakers. Now, I will say, as the fragrance dries and going to the dry down, it literally feels like the varnish is drying right alongside the fragrance. So, imagine that wet looking feel when you first apply the varnish, and then all of a sudden it begins to take on that clear coat feeling, right? It's a brilliant adaptation, I would say, and I thoroughly enjoyed wearing this fragrance as my scent of the day today. It is interesting to me how David. One thing that's interesting is how David managed to keep this feeling of that dark, thick mahogany or ebony wood, if you would prefer, whatever dark wood you want to think about, smelling of deep, ancient, rich wood, how it didn't soften up much into the dry down. I mean, it does turn more traditionally woody because I think more of the woody cedar notes start to come through, which will remind you of Gucci Pour Homme, the original from 2003, in my opinion. But how he managed to create this wood that stays in that deep tone of reddish dark brown, almost leaning black, almost leaning like this black hue, if you will. And when you factor the varnish on top in that smell, I think it's a beautiful creation. Now, it is end of June here in Texas, so it's hot as the blazes, hotter than the Dickens, as they say. And so for summer, most folks would not have the intestinal fortitude to wear something like this, but they would probably scoff at me for wearing something like this in summer. However, I think that a big downside to this scent for some folks could be wearability, okay? Where would you wear such a fragrance that smells like this? For me, I wear anything anytime, and I could give two shits what other people think, to be quite honest with you. I don't really like to wear things that are appropriate anyways. I like wearing outlandish, crazy things. It's just who I am. But the reality of the situation is that if you are someone who's stuck on things like proper seasons, this is probably a fall and a winter scent for most people. Or if you're stuck on kind of when is the right time to wear a fragrance like this, I don't want to wear this to the office because I don't want to be out of place, or, if you're that kind of person, you may struggle with finding a proper time to wear something like Bowmakers. I will tell you that. And I think that this is more for the connoisseurs out there, the more detail-oriented folks who like to search for those details. Like, for example, one thing I didn't mention in the scent is that there are these green touches here and there that come through. Like, for example, the cypress. Cypress is green, medicinal, and of course that colophony pine rosin note. And that gives off green touches as well because of the pine. Also, there is supposedly this walnut note, which I can't say I pick out a walnut note, not in the traditional sense I would expect a walnut to smell like. I think most people know what walnut smells like, but I don't pick that out in the traditional sense. I also don't get that Airaccord at all, that fresh Airaccord. Nope. If you go watch my review of, if you go to my Andy Tower playlist, you'll see a review called L'Air des Alpes. Air over the Swiss Alps is what it translates to. L'Air des Alpes Suisses, I think it was called. But that is a beautiful, proper Airaccord. That smells like you would expect an Airaccord to smell, right? Here, I don't get that outdoors Airaccord at all. So that's interesting. But I do think that if you focus on the deeper, darker aspects of the scent, you'll kind of imagine a better idea of what this smells like if you've never smelled this before. So a lot of my reviews, I try and I want this to be a little bit like an encyclopedia where people can come and see if I've reviewed a scent and what I think about it. And of course, this is all according to my nose. Your nose may be different, but for me, I get much more of the darker elements of the scent. I don't think the fresh air accord would have gone very well with this anyways. But I will tell you that there are a couple from this brand now, Bowmakers and Amber Kiso, that I would love to add to the collection. If it wasn't for the no-buy, I would probably buy these if I could find them at a discounted rate. Probably wouldn't pay $250 or $300, but if I could find this for $100 or so, or somewhere around there, I would probably go for it. So again, thank you to David for sending me this very generous sample and all those lovely cigars. I really enjoyed smoking those. And thank you to whoever my perfume god person was that sent me the second sample of Bowmakers, which made this happen. Although, screw you, DS and Durga, for not being able to make a damn sample that sprays. But if you have experience with Bowmakers, do let me know. To all my perfume god people, thank you very much. It's a pleasure doing these videos. And to everyone who sent me a sample and kind of makes it easier for me to continue to do these reviews and not put up my own hard-earned money. Well, I've spent a lot of my hard-earned money, but not put up more and more to get samples and constantly do these reviews. Thank you. I very much appreciate that. It makes it much easier to continue doing these for the channel. There is a ton of stuff out there. It never ends. No matter how much you do, I could do a video a day until the day I die, and there'd be, you know, I'd cover this much of the entire spectrum of fragrance. So you got to kind of pick and choose. That's why everyone's journey is different. But we are approaching 9,000 subscribers, which I'm very, very proud of, especially for somebody who just hits start, talks, and then hits play with zero editing, zero names on the screen, mostly because I don't know how to do that, nor do I care to learn. I put the name in the description, so you can click on the description if you want to kind of see some of the names I talked about in the video. But yes, I mean, I'm excited to get to 9,000. 10,000's right around the corner. So thank you to everyone who watches, subscribes, likes, all that stuff, shares the videos. It's a pleasure and an honor. So cheers, guys. Hope everyone finishes out the weekend strong. Catch you next time. Bye-bye.